is Janet and Jay Britton from Cherry Tree. So once again, it's wonderful to be with you. I very much unintentionally started my lesson last week with a little bit of a fib, and of course a little bit means that's what kind of fib a preacher tells Eddie, a little one. If it was anyone else, it would be a big one, but it was very much unintentional. I'd mentioned that we were going to look at Exodus chapters 14 through 17, and I had absolutely every intention of making it through those chapters. However, we didn't quite make it that far. So I hope to hold that promise again tonight. And I want to be mindful. I want to cite the fact that what I think is a great outline has come from the Power Lectures that take place in South Haven, Mississippi. And so I've relied quite extensively for these lessons. I understand that some people are so smart and original. They have original lessons, and all the time I do find for me it helps me not to get stuck in my own ruts, to reach out to some other individuals' outlines from time to time, and to present them from one manner or another from that. So I do appreciate the hard work that others have done. In particular, this lesson we're looking at tonight, B.J. Clark. So I appreciate being able to glean from some of the hard work and great presentation that he made on this topic. We noted last week that in Exodus, the second chapter, we've been studying through this third and final earthly phase of Moses' life, that of the pathway to Jericho, or we might say the wilderness, that it in many ways has its roots back here in Exodus, second chapter, in verse 23 and 24, where where Scripture says that the people cried out and God heard them. And sometimes I wonder when we pray if we really expect God to hear us and we understand how much God is paying attention to what we're saying. And because of the attitudes and the actions that we see in the people that follow this, I suspect that maybe these people were crying out but really didn't expect their prayers to be answered. However, what we do see is that these people had an amazing demonstration that followed of the power of God. They saw the grace of God. They experienced the fulfillment of the promises of God. And yet by chapter 14 and verse 10, we see that they are lashing out. In fact, the word cried there is very similar to thundered or thundering against God. And of course, we noted that this is the point at which they are along the Red Sea and they're watching Egypt come bearing down with them. I had the little comic of Stewie up here last week because as we go throughout these passages that we are going to work through, surely God must have felt as a parent would with a very obnoxious, loud, demanding, and illogical thunderings or cryings of a child. But that pattern continues throughout these 40 years in the wilderness until finally in Numbers, the 14th chapter, verses 20 through 24, here is we are on the very edge of the promised land, and God has provided for these people in every way possible. They balk and they refuse to go forward and to take the land that God had promised them. And so God says to Moses, I will destroy these people and I will give you a mightier and greater nation. And Moses cries out for the people and says, Lord, don't do that. And of course, I believe there's a great testing of Moses and certainly a revelation or revealing of Moses' character in what is said there. And so we read in Numbers, the 14th chapter, verses 20 through 24, Then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word But truly, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despised me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he was a different spirit, and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. And so we see it as though God has said enough's enough. And this is the point where he sends them into the wilderness until an entire generation, as the Hebrew writer says, their carcasses fell in the wilderness. And so these people just refuse to truly seek after and follow God, but rather are murmuring and complaining and balking at every step of the way. And so there comes a point when God says, enough is enough, no one but Caleb will enter my land. And of course, we'll come back to Caleb in a few moments. But we started there in the 14th chapter, noting that the fretful become forgetful. That they had fretted so much that they were forgetting who was in charge and all the blessings they had. And of course, we know that God uses Moses to split the Red Sea, and that the Israelites walk across on dry land, and yet the Egyptians try to follow them, and they are drowned in the very same path that the Israelites walked across. And so you'd say, surely these people understand that God is going to take care of them. And yet, it's the very next chapter, into chapter 15, when they've been thirsty for 3 days, and they get to Marah, which means bitterness. They find the water to be bitter. And rather than praying and asking for help and reaching out in positive ways, what we see is that they are murmuring against God and against Moses. And so despite what they deserve, God tells Moses to throw a log into the stream, and he takes that bitter water and it becomes sweet. And so surely you'd think at this point, as chapter 14 shows the people crying out and saying, oh God, you don't care about us. In chapter 15, yet God delivers them. In chapter 15, I'll learn to count before the night's over. Chapter 15, we see the people once again crying out and saying, oh, God doesn't care about us. And yet God delivers them. And now you would think surely they've learned their lesson. Albeit we turn over to chapter 16. If you're there with me, I encourage you to read verses 1 and 2 as we see exactly what the people said and how they reacted. Chapter 16, verse 1 says, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Starting to sound like a bit of a repetitive situation, isn't it? It's starting to feel as though God surely might say, and of course we see him kind of saying this in Numbers, the 14th chapter, but it would seem as though maybe we would arrive at this, or at least I would arrive at this way earlier. Just can't keep these people happy. And we noted that these people are in difficult situations. And we could say, well, God's delivering them. And yet everything they knew is changing. They were taken from the land they knew, and they go out into the wilderness, and they experience one difficulty after another. And I don't think it can be overemphasized enough that God is not chastising these people for crying out. In fact, in Exodus 2nd chapter, we see that God says he heard their groanings and their cryings. But they're no longer groaning under the heavy laden or the heavy burden. Now they are grumbling. And there certainly is a difference. Now, it's interesting to me that if we compare 16:1 to the 12th chapter and verse 6, we won't get into the calendar that they were given in the book of Exodus. But essentially, at this point, we are 1 month out of Egypt. Can you imagine? All this has taken place in 1 month. That is, significant to me because they just aren't getting the point. They aren't following along. And so they get to this next difficult situation. And that is that they are in the wilderness. And now, instead of being thirsty, they are hungry. And so, what would they say? If they had a refreshed memory, because we've noted along, we'll continue to note that the fretful become forgetful. If their memory was refreshed, they'd look back at the Red Sea and say, well, God will take care of us. They'd look back at Mara and say, God will provide. God will help us through this. God cares for us. But that's not at all what they do. They don't go to Moses and say, hey, let's pray about this. Moses, what is the plan? What's going on here? Instead, they're lashing out. It's interesting to me the progression of the nature of the grumblings. If we look back in chapter 15 and in verse 24, and you'll remember if we go back even further into chapter 14, that the people cry out first against God and then to Moses. And so it continues to grow. In verse 24 of chapter 15, and the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? So at this point in chapter 15, the people are grumbling against Moses. In chapter 16, in verse 2, and the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So we have an escalation of grumbling to the people, meaning, I think, a group of people, to the whole congregation, everyone in unison, reaching out and complaining. We also see this progression from complaining against Moses to complain against Moses and Aaron. In other words, if you're affiliated with leadership, you're in trouble. It's going to be a bad situation. But the people really ramp it up, I believe, when we get to verse 3. And notice verse 3, if you would. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now, what in the world could we say that Moses had done to be worthy of being accused of wanting to kill the people? Why in the world would he left his home in Midian? Would he drug his family across the desert and into a hostile and aggressive Egypt and stood before the very face of Pharaoh, contending for the people, and then put so much effort into leading them, and through by God delivering and providing for them, to now be accused of, you want no more than to kill us. I know why you brought us out here, just so you can kill us by the wayside or out in the wilderness. I introduced this idea, and I have a picture of protesting up here, and I tried very hard to find a non-offensive picture of protesters, and I found that nearly an impossible task because of the very nature of what's taking place. People are getting frustrated in every possible way right now. And boy, I understand that. I'm at the point of frustration myself with the difficulty of the situation, with the lack of clarity in some of the messages that we get from our leadership, There, I believe, are legitimate concerns about our civil rights that are before us. And I in no way would suggest that it is wrong or that no one should protest. We see protests taking place all over the place. I believe as Christians, though, and I will emphasize in this country in particular, I'm grateful to have the right to protest. As Christians, however, I think we need to be very careful how we protest, whether it's on the steps of the Capitol in Harrisburg or on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, or whether it's at home on our computers. We need to be very careful of how we protest. It's amazing to me how many times you see the nature of these protests, and the accusations against leaders is such that it's paramount to accuse them of mass murder. I believe if we're going to accuse someone of mass murder, of willingly causing the death of the death toll of coronavirus in the U.S., as of this morning when I last looked at, was a little over 67,000 people. I think we better be very sure of our sources before we accuse anyone of willfully killing 67,000 people. I'm not saying that the Christian ought not protest. I'm saying we ought to be certain of our sources, and we ought to be careful of the accusations we level, if for no other reason people notice. I got a call from a friend of mine that is occasionally with us here online. He's not a church goer, generally speaking. Occasionally he does, but he called me shortly after the Harrisburg protest. He said, "Mike, I have a question for you." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I saw all these protesters down there in Harrisburg." He says, "and they're holding signs that say, 'I'm nobody's sheep.'" He said, "Do you think they say the same thing on Sunday mornings?" I can't answer for them. My point is that we need to be certain, we need to be careful, we need to be mindful that people are watching. And as I believe we'll note in a little bit, more than just people are watching. The groaners, again, have become grumblers. And as they've grumbled, as we noted, and been fretful, they've become also forgetful. So forgetful that it's as though this is the very first difficult time they've been in. It's as though they've never been in a hard spot before and have seen the power of God. It's as though just a few days earlier, God did not provide for them by making the bitter water sweet. It's as though a few days before that, He didn't split the Red Sea right in half for them to march across on dry land. It's as though He didn't bring the greatest nation in the world at that time to their knees through an amazing display of plagues to deliver His people. It's as though it was their first encounter with God ever. Dad, I can't imagine you ever heard when you uttered no, that awful word, no. You never cared about me anyways. You always liked so-and-so better. Now, I don't remember particularly saying that or any of my siblings saying that, but we've seen that. We've probably unintentionally, or we've probably unfortunately uttered words like that ourselves, maybe towards our parents or towards someone else, and we've certainly probably been on the receiving side of this. It's amazing to me how much you can help someone, how much good you can do for someone, and yet the first time you say no, they'll say, "Oh, you never did care, you never did want me to succeed, you never wanted," and the line goes on and on and on. Well, that's the way these people are treating God. What a horrible, horrible situation. May it be that even in the most difficult situations in our life, we don't treat God as though we have never had an experience with Him before, as though He's not delivered us in the past, as though He's not demonstrated His love for us. because he has demonstrated it for them and he's demonstrated it for us. They forgot what it was like in Egypt. I don't know if this jumped out at you or not. I suppose it did, but to this point I've been emphasizing other points. Boy, if you'd listened to these people at this point talk about what it was like in Egypt, you'd have thought they were in paradise. They forgot the realities of the difficult situation they were in. They forgot that Egypt was not a picnic. They forgot that the misery in Egypt was so significant that they were groaning and crying under the burden that they were carrying. And so the question comes up, have the criers become liars? Have the criers become liars? I don't know if it's intentional lie on their behalf or not, but I think that we can't get around the fact that in this case the liars have become criers. They have overemphasized their current situation or the struggles of their current situation and underemphasized the significance of their past struggles. They're painting this picture as though they're lost people now and had it wonderful before Moses was sent by God to deliver them out of the people. So they forgot the realities of both where they were and where they'd come from. And I believe verses 7 through 12, as we'll read here in a moment, will suggest that they likely have forgotten the omnipresence and the omniscience of God. Now, those are big words that maybe all of us don't use on a regular basis, but that means simply that God is everywhere and that God knows everything. They've forgotten that God heard their cries in Egypt and he hears them now. I say that I believe they've forgotten that because notice what Moses says to them starting in verse 7. Verse 7 reads, "And in the morning," this is Moses speaking, "you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumblings against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?" Notice also that Moses keeps saying, who do you think Aaron and I are that you're attacking us? Verse 8, "And Moses said, when the Lord gives you in the morning meat to eat, and in the morning bread to be the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling." And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked towards the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Moses, over and over, is saying to these people, God has heard your grumbling. God has heard you. And he's reminding them over and over. Now, how could they possibly forget? The psalmist in 106 in verses 7 through 13, really that whole psalm, I encourage you to read it if you would and to look at. But over and over again, the psalmist said that they witnessed the greatness of God and yet they forgot what he had done for them. I believe the case is that when the groaner has become the grumbler, we have went from groaning under the burden of our current situation and grumbling against those whom we care about. I forgot I was going to start by reading this. I got so excited about the call-outs, I completely forgot. But I need to read out of this twice. Now, I mentioned a couple weeks ago I've been on Amazon just shopping away, and this dandy came the other day, and Amanda tried to hide it, I believe. She says she didn't hide it, but I found it over in the corner of the kitchen. And I found that, and I dug it out, and I said, why are you hiding this? But it's the encyclopedia of 7,700 illustrations. So I'm not going to bother reading all 7,700 illustrations to you tonight, but I do have two of them out of this book. If I bought a book this big, I better get to using it. So this one is titled, "The Uglies Are Complaining." The uglies are complaining. According to a United Press International write-up, the uglies picketed an American Airlines ticket office in protest of alleged discrimination in hiring when they advertise for good-looking people. Danny McCoy, president of Uglies Unlimited, led 18 uglies from his organization formed to fight biased social structures that discriminate against ugly people. "We just want to be accepted for who we are instead of what we look like," said McCoy. "We talked to employment agencies who say it is much easier to place attractive persons. The problem is most flagrant in newspaper advertisements, which say such things as attractive receptionist or pretty secretaries needed." McCoy said the Fort Worth Uglies is the first group of its kind in the country. He has started a campaign to spread its message across the nation. McCoy estimates that up to 10% of the American public are widely considered to be ugly. The uglies are complaining. Now let me see, there are 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us here tonight. If we'd have reached that 10 number, that would have meant that at least one of us statistically is ugly. But I think it's an interesting article there when we get to complaining and grumbling to consider. The uglies are complaining. As we come back to our passage here in the 16th chapter, in verses 4 through 7, we see God's reaction. So these people are hungry and they're crying out and they're grumbling against Moses and Aaron. So what's his reaction? It's interesting to me that, again, he doesn't put them in their place. He doesn't tell them to be quiet, but rather in verse 4 we read, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it is what the Lord has brought you, that is the Lord who has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumblings against the Lord. For what are we that you should grumble against us?" God's reaction is not to scold them, but rather to graciously rain from heaven the manna that would sustain them, that would feed them, that would meet their needs for some 40 years. We serve a gracious, wonderful, and loving Father. Verse 20 of this same chapter says, "But they did not listen to Moses." Now, what are they supposed to be listening to? Moses he tells them, and God even tells Moses, "I'm going to test them. I'm going to give them manna, a sweet bread from heaven, to feed them every day. But here's how I want this to happen. They will gather enough each day to eat for that day. Do not take enough for 2 days, except for on Friday. On Friday, you are to gather for 2 days, because you are not supposed to go out and gather on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day of rest." What do you think happened? Well, you can guess. Number one, the first day, the manna falls from heaven, and you can read this in between verses that we didn't read tonight, but they go out, and the first thing they do is gather enough for 2 days, just in case there's not enough there for tomorrow, I guess. But sure enough, next morning they come to their cupboard, they open their jars, and they're full of worms. Then again, on the Sabbath day, there they are when they're not supposed to be out gathering, and they're gathering. Now why? Why did they gather? when they weren't supposed to? Why didn't they do what was instructed? I believe one and even likely answers is that they were too busy complaining to hear the instructions. Now, Dad, I brought up my childhood a few times. I never made that mistake, did I? He's not going to answer too emphatically. We can get so busy complaining and grumbling that we miss what we're supposed to be doing. Aesop tells this fable. A heavy wagon was being dragged along a country lane by a team of oxen. The wheels groaned and creaked terribly. The oxen turned around and spoke to the wheels. "Hey there! Why do you make so much noise? We bear all the labor, and we, not you, ought to cry out." These people are busy complaining, groaning under the horrible load that they have to carry. Meanwhile, it is Moses, it is Aaron, it is God who is carrying the load, to the point that they are grumbling and don't even hear what it is that they should be doing in replacement. Let never be the case that the groaners have become the grumblers. Fourthly, we will note tonight that the friction will lead to fiction. The friction will lead to fiction. Chapter 17 and verses 1 through 3 read as this. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Well, now, once again, we are thirsty. We went from being thirsty to being hungry, and once again, we are thirsty again. What is the response of these people? We see there's no water to drink. It's a serious proposition. It's a serious issue that they need to face. And it's not the fact that they cry out for water that God condemns them or rebukes them, but rather their response. In fact, verse 2 brings out this idea. The ESV says, "Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said." I can't remember right off the King James translation there. I did read it. Chided. That's it, what it was. Thank you. The people chided with Moses. Now, it's my understanding that the Greek root here is, and B.J. Clark brings this out, it really is very similar to the idea of a lawsuit. When you bring suit against someone, the people are calling out or bringing a suit, an official complaint, an accusation against Moses. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, again, this individual that was trying to serve them, was trying to help them, we get into verse 3, that they have continued to be thirsty, and they grumble against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Boy, now there are flat out accusations of fiction. You see, the friction kept building and building and building until now these accusations have taken root. In fact, we are going to continue to see this in Deuteronomy, the first chapter, in verse 27. Years later, the accusations made against Moses and against God, "You've brought us out here to die because you hate us. You hate us." I have a question. How is it possible in these last two murmuring sessions that we see the whole congregation in unison crying out against Moses? It starts out, seems like a group of people, and we've built to the point that the whole congregation is calling out against them. Well, we'll bring this up in just another moment or re-emphasize it, but I think it's useful to understand that we have an impact on those around us. This fiction has kept growing and growing. You see that the forgetfulness, the fretfulness led to forgetfulness, and the people got so forgetful that there seems to be an increase of friction, and the friction is leading to fiction. And now the fiction has got to the point that there's faction against Moses and against Aaron. Now, we don't use that word faction very often, but that's a party. That's our political, we've got a two-faction system or a two-party system. You see, it's built so much momentum that other people have fallen in and now have taken up the accusation. They're saying it because they heard someone else say it, who heard someone else say it, who heard someone else say it. Thanks be to God that with the advent or invent of Facebook, that problem's went completely away, right? We don't have that problem anymore. Mike Harper shared this quote this morning, and I absolutely had to look it up. He shared it on his Facebook, and a quote from Sherlock Holmes. And I thought it was wonderful. I had to use it. Never theorize before you have data. Invariably, you end up twisting facts to suit your theories instead of theories to suit your facts. Such is the case with our current situation. We need to make sure that we have good data before we create theories. Such is the case in the church. We need to make sure that we have good facts to support our theory. Fifthly and lastly, we will note that the murmuring could lead to murdering. Now, I think you may say to yourself, now hold on, all I did was just a little bit of complaining. How can that be paramount to murdering? Well, again, we have an impact on one another. We have an impact on situations, and we should be mindful of that. Notice what Moses says in verse 4. So verse 4 says, "So Moses cried to the Lord, 'What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me.'" In a few moments we'll look at Numbers, the 13th chapter and 14th chapter again. We'll see this is a trend that builds. It becomes more regular. This isn't the last time they're ready to stone Moses. These people have allowed this fiction to create such a deep faction that the murmuring has led to near murdering. Now, we'll start before investigating our impact with noting God's response. God stands behind his people. It's interesting to me in verses 5 and 6, he says, "Moses, get the elders of the people of Israel and bring them up to this rock. And I will stand before you on the rock, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come forth." He brings Moses out. He makes a demonstration to show all the people of Israel that he, or in particular the elders of Israel, so that all the people get the point, that he is using Moses to deliver to these people, not vice versa. Now, verse 7 is the point that I will conclude with tonight. And it's a point that I think I've overlooked much in much of my studying. Verse 7 says, "And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" Now, if you were to look up those two names that Moses gives this place, we would see that it means testing and quarreling. What's interesting to me, if you remember back to the previous murmuring, where the water was bitter, that place Moses named Mara, which means bitterness. In other words, these people are having an impact on everything they come across. Yeah, that's the place of bitterness. That's where the people complained about bitter water. Yeah, this is called the place of testing and quarreling. This is where they brought a lawsuit against Moses. They're leaving an impact on everyone, on each other, on Moses, on Aaron, and even the places they were. We leave an impact. I want to tell you something. When my little precious Anna comes through a room, she leaves an impact. Now, I don't just mean on sound. I mean, in our house, I can follow around, and there's really no direct line. There's no path. But I can tell everywhere she's been. Because there'll be a few things laying here, a few things laying there, and something laying there, and this laying there. And where this morning I had 3 of these, I was actually going to fill one with ketchup. One was gone. She left an impact in my office. She leaves an impact everywhere she goes. But you know what? Amanda leaves an impact where she goes too. She walks into a dirty room and it's almost like magic. The filth and the dirty dishes and things just start to disappear. It's amazing. I saw an individual once talk about his magic coffee table. He said, it's amazing. I throw anything I want on there, and by morning it's all folded. The laundry's folded and everything's put away. It's a magic coffee table. Well, his girlfriend or his wife wasn't so impressed with what he was saying. Amanda leaves an impact on the rooms that she's in. Brothers and sisters, you and I are leaving an impact on the places we encounter, the people we're in contact with. And in a time like this, I believe we are leaving an impact on history. Let's be mindful that murmuring can lead to murdering. Next week, Lord willing, we will continue on, and we are going to start by looking at the idea that doubting causes pouting. And we have a few more illustrations from these times of testing that the people put God through. I pray that this lesson has been helpful and useful for you in your efforts to be pleasing to God. I pray that you would be healthy and safe as you go throughout this week. And I pray that you would be spiritually strengthened and grow closer to our Lord and Savior each and every day. If in any way the congregation here at Summerville can help you, if I personally can help you, our contact information is stated clearly on our website. We're listed on Google and so many other different places.